Alan Dershowitz thought he could humiliate Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett on live television by mocking her law degree. What the Texas Democrat did next left the Harvard legend speechless and exposed the legal establishment's biggest secret forever. Picture this. CNN studio lights blazing as two legal titans prepare for what everyone thought would be a routine political discussion. On one side, Alan Dershowitz, 85 years old, Harvard law professor emeritus, defender of celebrities for 5 decades. His confidence radiating like he owns every room he enters. On the other side, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, 43, civil rights attorney turned Texas representative. Sharp eyes, ready for battle, representing everything the old legal establishment fears. But this wasn't going to be polite legal discussion. Within minutes, Dershowitz would launch an attack that stunned millions, questioning not just Crockett's knowledge, but her very right to speak on constitutional law. He thought his Harvard pedigree would silence this congresswoman from Dallas. He was catastrophically wrong. One legal expert watching whispered, "Alan just made a mistake that's about to destroy his reputation. He has no idea what Jasmine Crockett is capable of. You're about to witness legal history being made." The tension in that CNN studio was absolutely electric. Camera operators instinctively zoomed in, sensing something massive brewing. Dershowitz wore his trademark smirk of academic superiority, while Crockett displayed the laser focus of a trial lawyer who'd prepared for war. The production crew could feel it in the air, that rare moment when routine television becomes must-see drama. Anderson Cooper, veteran of thousands of high-stakes interviews, would later admit this felt different from the very first second. What made this confrontation so explosive wasn't just the clash of personalities. This represented a seismic battle between two completely different worlds of American legal expertise. You had the old guard, predominantly white, male, Ivy League educated, convinced their institutional credentials automatically made them the ultimate authorities on constitutional law. They'd controlled legal discourse for generations through nothing more than where they went to school. Then you had the new generation diverse leaders who earned their positions through actual merit, real-world courtroom experience, and genuine connection with communities the establishment had ignored for decades. This wasn't just a debate about presidential immunity or constitutional law. This was about who gets to speak with authority in America, and whether your law school matters more than what you actually know. Neither lawyer realized it yet, but one reputation was about to be enhanced forever, while another would be seriously damaged on live television. To understand why this confrontation mattered so much, you need to know exactly who these legal titans really are. For over 50 years, Alan Dershowitz has been the face of elite American legal education. Harvard law professor, author of dozens of books, defender of O.J. Simpson, Jeffrey Epstein, and Donald Trump. At 85, he's accustomed to being the smartest person in every room, the authority everyone automatically defers to. Dershowitz built his entire career on constitutional law and an unshakable belief in his own intellectual superiority. He's appeared on every major news program, written for every major newspaper, commanded respect from the legal establishment for decades simply because of those 3 magic words: Harvard Law School. His credentials opened every door. His reputation preceded him into every courtroom and television studio. But lately, cracks had been showing. His association with Jeffrey Epstein seriously damaged his standing. His defense of Trump alienated former allies. Younger lawyers were openly questioning whether his time had passed. Still, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed his Harvard pedigree made him absolutely untouchable. Jasmine Crockett represents everything that terrifies the old legal establishment. Born in St. Louis, she worked her way through college and law school without the privilege and connections that define elite legal circles. She earned her law degree from University of Houston Law Center, not Harvard or Yale, but a respected institution that produces lawyers who actually fight for real people facing real problems. Before Congress, Crockett built her reputation as a civil rights attorney in Dallas. Police brutality cases, voting rights fights, representing clients who couldn't afford fancy white shoe law firms. She didn't write academic papers for other professors to read. She fought in actual courtrooms, won real cases, changed real lives. When she arrived in Congress in 2023, Crockett immediately became known for surgical questioning during committee hearings, her ability to slice through political nonsense with legal precision, and her complete refusal to be intimidated by anyone's reputation or pedigree. She represents a new generation of Black women leaders who combine genuine legal expertise with political intelligence and aren't afraid to challenge anyone who tries to dismiss them. But tonight on CNN, she was walking directly into Dershowitz's territory, a nationally televised legal discussion where academic credentials and institutional prestige traditionally matter more than actual courtroom experience. For Dershowitz, this represented an existential threat to everything he believed about legal hierarchy. His entire worldview depended on elite education creating elite minds, that Harvard credentials automatically meant intellectual superiority. For Crockett, this was another opportunity to prove that real legal expertise isn't measured by your diploma, but by what you accomplish with your knowledge when it actually matters. This confrontation represented a massive cultural earthquake happening across America right now. The legal profession has been wrestling with a fundamental question. Does where you went to law school determine how smart you are? Traditional power structures remain dominated by graduates from a handful of elite institutions. Young lawyers from state schools and diverse backgrounds constantly find themselves having to prove their intelligence to partners and judges who assume Ivy League automatically equals competence. But here's what's really happening. Law schools are becoming more diverse. While the old boys network desperately clings to outdated assumptions about who deserves respect and authority, Crockett's very presence in Congress challenges these assumptions. She didn't attend Harvard or Yale, yet she's proven more effective at constitutional questioning than colleagues who did. She represents districts facing America's most complex legal and social challenges, handling them with sophistication that makes elite legal education look completely irrelevant. This battle goes far beyond law. It's about expertise versus credentials, merit versus privilege, real-world results versus institutional prestige. Every profession deals with this tension, but rarely do we see it play out so dramatically on national television. Women and people of color recognize this dynamic immediately. That moment when someone questions your qualifications instead of addressing your arguments, when they try to diminish your expertise by attacking where you came from rather than engaging with what you know. For millions watching, this represented their own workplace struggles, their own experiences being underestimated, their own fights to prove that competence comes from performance, not pedigree. The stage was perfectly set for a collision between two radically different visions of American expertise, and neither participant had any idea that this conversation would end with one reputation soaring and another crashing down. The CNN segment started innocently enough. Anderson Cooper had invited both legal experts to discuss Trump's federal election interference case, exactly the kind of routine panel discussion both had done hundreds of times before. Let's start with constitutional questions surrounding executive privilege, Cooper began, looking between his guests. Professor Dershowitz, you've written extensively about presidential powers. Dershowitz leaned forward, sliding into his comfort zone like putting on a familiar jacket. Anderson, this is precisely the kind of complex constitutional issue that requires deep academic understanding of founding principles and decades of rigorous scholarship. The courts need historical precedent, not political reactions. His tone was unmistakably professorial, condescending in that particular way academic experts use when they assume they're explaining complicated concepts to people who couldn't possibly grasp the sophisticated nuances of their field. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if teaching constitutional law to first-year students rather than discussing it with a practicing attorney and elected representative. Crockett listened quietly, taking mental notes, her expression neutral but intensely focused. She'd heard this exact brand of academic pontificating countless times before, and she knew exactly where it was heading. Congresswoman Crockett, Cooper continued, you've been vocal about accountability in this case. What's your perspective? Thank you, Anderson, Crockett responded, her voice crisp and professional. While constitutional scholarship matters, we can't ignore practical reality. The evidence shows clear patterns of behavior that violated both constitutional principles and federal law. The question isn't whether the presidency deserves respect. It's whether anyone, including presidents, can be above the law. Her answer was direct, grounded in facts, focused on real-world implications. She spoke like a lawyer who'd actually practiced constitutional law, not just studied it in academic seminars. Dershowitz's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He'd expected automatic deference to his expertise, not a confident alternative perspective delivered with such precision. His response would reveal the first dangerous hint of condescension that would eventually explode into career-damaging disrespect. "Well, Congresswoman," Dershowitz began, his voice carrying that particular tone academics use when they think they're being patient with intellectual inferiors, "I appreciate your political perspective, but constitutional law requires more nuanced understanding than what we typically see in congressional hearings. These are sophisticated legal principles that take years of serious study to fully grasp." The comment hung in the studio air like a verbal slap. He just implied that Crockett's analysis was superficial, that her elected position somehow disqualified her from serious constitutional discussion. It was the kind of dismissive comment women and people of color hear constantly in professional settings, the suggestion that their expertise isn't quite real or sufficient. Crockett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained perfectly steady. "Professor, I think you might be surprised by how much constitutional law congresspeople actually need to understand. We take an oath to defend the Constitution, and many of us take that responsibility very seriously." Of course," Dershowitz replied, waving his hand with casual dismissiveness. "But there's a fundamental difference between political understanding and genuine legal scholarship. The kind of deep constitutional analysis this case requires comes from academic training and decades of serious study." Cooper attempted to redirect the conversation toward specific legal precedents, but Dershowitz couldn't resist his need to establish intellectual dominance. When Crockett offered detailed analysis of relevant case law, citing specific Supreme Court decisions and their constitutional implications, Dershowitz made the catastrophic mistake that would define the rest of the evening. "Congresswoman, you're citing cases, which is fine, but do you actually have the legal training to understand their constitutional significance? I mean, where exactly did you study law?" The question was delivered with a slight smile, that particular brand of academic condescension that says, "I already know this answer won't impress me." He was setting up what he assumed would be an easy way to establish his superiority, the classic elite lawyer move of credential checking to dismiss someone's arguments without addressing their substance. Crockett paused for just a moment, recognizing exactly what was happening. She'd been in this situation before, but never on national television. This was her moment. "I studied at University of Houston Law Center," Crockett replied evenly, her voice carrying new steel. "Not Harvard, if that's what you're getting at." Dershowitz's smile widened with obvious satisfaction. "Ah, well, that explains our different analytical approaches. Houston is fine for a regional school, I'm sure, but constitutional law at this level really requires the rigorous training you get at top-tier institutions. Harvard, Yale, places that truly prepare lawyers for complex constitutional questions." The CNN studio went dead silent. Cooper looked genuinely uncomfortable, clearly recognizing his guest had crossed from academic disagreement into personal attack. Even camera operators stopped moving, sensing something significant was happening. "Professor Dershowitz," Crockett said, her voice still calm but with a prosecutorial edge that made Cooper sit straighter, "are you suggesting that lawyers from non-Ivy League schools can't understand constitutional law?" "I'm stating facts about educational standards," Dershowitz replied, still confident he held the upper hand. "Constitutional scholarship requires academic rigor that most regional schools simply can't provide." Crockett leaned back slightly, and anyone who knew her would have recognized the look in her eyes. She was no longer just responding to condescension. She was preparing to systematically destroy it. "That's fascinating, Professor. So you believe where someone studied determines their constitutional understanding. Experience matters, Congresswoman. Academic pedigree matters. These aren't controversial statements." "Well then," Crockett said, her voice taking on a tone that made legal experts watching from across America lean forward in their chairs, "let's test that theory. Since you value rigorous analysis, let's discuss the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and executive accountability. You've argued that presidential immunity should be broadly interpreted, but doesn't that contradict the Supreme Court's holding in Nixon versus Fitzgerald? Specifically, the court's distinction between civil and criminal liability." Dershowitz shifted uncomfortably. The question was precisely sophisticated, referencing complex legal distinctions that required deep constitutional understanding. Nixon versus Fitzgerald dealt with civil suits, he replied, trying to regain footing. Exactly, Crockett continued, her eyes lighting up, which brings us to Clinton versus Jones, where the court specifically rejected broad presidential immunity claims. The court held that presidents aren't above the law, even while in office. She continued without pause, building her argument like the experienced trial lawyer she was. But let's go deeper, since you value thorough scholarship. Clinton relied heavily on Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer, Justice Jackson's concurrence establishing the framework for executive power analysis. You're familiar with Justice Jackson's 3 categories of presidential authority. Dershowitz nodded, but his confident smile was evaporating. Crockett was demonstrating constitutional command that exceeded his expectations by miles. Good. Then you recognize that when presidents act without constitutional authorization, as evidence suggests happened here, presidential power is at its lowest ebb. The court's language was clear. Presidential claims to constitutional power face the most rigorous judicial scrutiny. Now, Professor, here's where my regional law school education becomes relevant. I've litigated constitutional cases involving government accountability. I've stood in federal courtrooms arguing that officials can't hide behind immunity when they violate constitutional rights. You can study constitutional theory at Harvard all you want, Crockett continued, her voice gaining intensity, but until you've argued in federal court that government officials can't escape accountability when they violate people's rights, you don't understand what constitutional protection actually means. I've represented clients whose voting rights were violated by officials claiming they were just following orders. I've fought cases where government officials argued their positions made them untouchable. And here's what I learned. The Constitution doesn't care about your credentials or your position. It cares about your actions. But let's discuss your record, Professor, Crockett said, her prosecutorial training fully engaged. You've spent considerable time defending powerful clients who used their positions to avoid accountability. Jeffrey Epstein, for instance. The studio went absolutely silent. Cooper's eyes widened. Legal experts watching nationwide felt their breath catch. You used your Harvard expertise to argue that a man who sexually abused minors deserved lenient treatment. You crafted legal arguments to help him escape full accountability for heinous crimes. So tell me, Professor, what does that say about the rigorous academic training you're so proud of? Dershowitz's face reddened. That's completely unfair. I was providing constitutional representation. Were you? Crockett interrupted, her prosecutorial skills on full display. Or were you using elite credentials to help a wealthy predator escape justice? Because from my regional law school perspective, it looks like you used your Harvard pedigree to legitimize representing someone who deserved the full force of the law. Here's what's really interesting, Professor, Crockett continued, now in complete control. You want to discuss constitutional scholarship? Let's examine your recent arguments about presidential power. You've argued Trump's actions were protected by executive privilege, but your own previous scholarship contradicts that position. She referenced her preparation materials. In your 1982 article Executive Privilege, a constitutional myth, you wrote, quote, "No president should be permitted to hide behind executive privilege when evidence exists of potential criminal conduct. The Constitution demands accountability, not immunity. So either you were wrong in 1982 or you're wrong now. Either way, your rigorous Harvard training led to completely contradictory constitutional conclusions depending on which president you're defending. Constitutional principles don't change based on who's paying your legal fees, Professor. That's exactly the unprincipled approach my regional law school education taught me to recognize and reject." The aftermath was absolutely electric. Within 30 seconds of the segment ending, legal Twitter exploded. A Georgetown law professor posted, "Did Jasmine Crockett just deliver the most devastating takedown in legal television history? That wasn't a debate. That was a masterclass." Within 5 minutes, "Crockett destroys Dershowitz" was trending nationwide. The most viral moment, when Crockett quoted Dershowitz's own 1982 article back to him, would be viewed over 2 million times in the first hour alone. Legal professionals were sharing clips faster than CNN could upload them. At Legal Eagle, a popular lawyer YouTuber with 3 million followers, posted, "Holy shit, Jasmine Crockett just used Alan Dershowitz's own scholarship to expose his hypocrisy on live television. This is what happens when real trial lawyers meet academic blowhards." Law students across America began creating memes. The most popular showed Dershowitz's shocked face with the caption, "When you find out regional law schools actually teach constitutional law too." But the social media buzz was nothing compared to the earthquake in professional legal circles. Within an hour, the Harvard Law Review's Twitter account posted a thread analyzing Crockett's constitutional arguments, confirming every citation was accurate and every legal point precisely stated. Several prominent legal scholars began publicly reconsidering their assumptions about legal education. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw from UCLA tweeted, "What we witnessed is why diversity in legal education matters. Different perspectives create better lawyers, not just different lawyers." Even Harvard professors began distancing themselves from Dershowitz's performance. Professor Lawrence Tribe, one of Harvard's most respected constitutional scholars, posted, "Legal expertise is demonstrated through reasoning and knowledge, not institutional pedigree." Tonight's segment was a powerful reminder of that principle. Democratic strategists immediately recognized Crockett's performance as a blueprint for challenging elitist condescension with facts and preparation. Republican commentators were notably silent. Several conservative legal voices who might normally defend Dershowitz simply chose not to comment. The University of Houston Law Center reported a 40% increase in website traffic within 24 hours, with prospective students specifically mentioning the CNN segment. Law school admissions counselors at non-elite institutions began receiving calls from students asking about constitutional law programs and practical legal training. The message was crystal clear. Students wanted to learn law the way Crockett learned it, with emphasis on real-world application and principled advocacy rather than just academic theory. Several law schools announced new programs emphasizing practical constitutional advocacy, directly inspired by public interest in Crockett's approach. Within days, the confrontation's impact rippled through institutions nationwide. Law schools began emphasizing practical training over pure academic prestige. The traditional hierarchy based on artificial scarcity and historical privilege was being challenged by evidence that practical legal training could be just as valuable as elite credentials. Television producers across the media landscape took notice. Several networks reached out to Crockett's office requesting her availability for legal commentary. The message was clear. Audiences wanted legal experts who combined scholarly knowledge with real-world experience and principled advocacy. CNN itself began featuring more diverse legal commentators, including attorneys from non-elite schools who brought practical courtroom experience to their analysis. Young lawyers from diverse backgrounds found new confidence in their abilities. Law students at state institutions felt validated in their career choices. Women and people of color in professional settings had a powerful new example of responding to condescending behavior with intelligence and strength. Most significantly, Crockett had created a new template for challenging elitist condescension in public forums. Her approach, thorough preparation, precise arguments, and confident delivery began being studied by advocates across many fields. Public speaking coaches analyzed her technique. Political communications experts incorporated her methods into training programs. Law professors started using the exchange as an example of effective advocacy. Back in Congress, colleagues from both parties approached Crockett privately to express admiration. Democratic leadership began considering her for more prominent roles in constitutional discussions. Republican members became notably more respectful in subsequent committee interactions. The legal profession itself began a long overdue conversation about how expertise is defined and valued. Old assumptions about hierarchy and credentials were being questioned, and the profession would emerge stronger and more inclusive as a result. Alan Dershowitz attempted damage control with a blog post arguing his comments were taken out of context, but his explanation only made things worse. Legal Twitter erupted with screenshots comparing his post to video clips of his original comments, making his backtracking completely unconvincing. The revolution had been televised, broadcast to millions, and the old guard would never be quite the same. This confrontation will be remembered as the moment when elite credentials met real expertise, and expertise won decisively. It marked the end of an era when impressive diplomas could silence diverse voices, and the beginning of a new chapter where competence is measured by performance, not pedigree. For everyone watching this incredible showdown, the message couldn't be clearer. Never underestimate someone based on where they came from or where they went to school. Judge them by what they know, how they think, and what they stand for. Jasmine Crockett proved that constitutional expertise isn't about which law school accepted you. It's about how well you understand the principles you're supposed to uphold and how effectively you apply them when it matters most. In American politics and law, there are always more battles to be fought, more truth to be revealed, and more moments when the underdog proves that merit matters more than privilege. What did you think of Jasmine Crockett's performance? And don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see what real legal expertise looks like in action.